My name is Casey Brantley, 29 years old from Wamego, rural Kansas. My father built our Kansas farm with his bare hands, and I was meant to carry it on. But the day we buried him, my mother handed everything to her new husband and his spoiled kids. They thought I'd stay quiet. They thought they'd buried the truth with him. They were dead wrong. Before you hear how I took back everything they stole, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. This is more than a story about land, it's about blood, betrayal, and a legacy they tried to erase. Stick around, because what they buried didn't stay buried for long. The wind off the Kansas plains had a sharpness that day. Like it didn't care that we were burying a good man. The wheat just beyond the cemetery waved in silence, gold and heavy-headed. I stood at the edge of the grave in my only black suit, boots still dusty from the morning chores I'd forced myself to do out of habit. That was the kind of man my father raised: work first, grieve later. They lowered him into the ground as the preacher said words I barely heard. My hands were clenched so tight in front of me I left nail marks in my palms. I looked at the casket, polished dark oak just like the barn walls we used to build together. It didn't seem right, putting him in the earth when the harvest hadn't even come in. I wasn't ready to say goodbye. But apparently, someone else had been ready for a while. When I turned around, my mother was standing there, Marla Brantley, now Marla Layton, with a man who didn't belong on our land or at that funeral. Randy Layton wore a gray suit too shiny for Wamego and a smug expression he tried to pass off as solemn. His arm was around my mother's waist. They hadn't even waited until the headstone was carved before making their new life official. She didn't say a word to me as she walked up, just dabbed her eyes and took her place beside him. I stared at the hand on her hip, his hand, and remembered all the times Dad used to warn me about snakes hiding in the grass. The funeral wasn't cold yet, and already, I could feel the rot setting in. People were whispering. Old neighbors. Folks from the co-op. I caught the tail end of someone saying, "Didn't know she remarried already." Another voice muttered, "They were real close even before Troy passed." I tried to swallow the rage rising in my throat. Dad had been gone a week. 1 week. And this man, this outsider, was already wearing his seat at the table. I caught Jake and Morgan in the crowd too, Randy's kids from some previous mess of a marriage. They weren't crying. Hell, they looked bored. After the service, Mom tried to talk to me. Said something about healing and moving forward. I nodded. Bit my tongue. Walked away, but as I climbed into my truck, I looked back one more time. Randy was shaking hands, smiling just enough. Like he'd won something. Like burying my father was just the final step in whatever scheme he'd been working on behind closed doors. That's when it hit me, something wasn't right. Not just emotionally, but legally. And when it came time for the will to be read, I'd learned just how far betrayal can go when it's wearing your mother's face, and from that moment on, I knew, this wasn't just grief, this was war. I walked into the law office still in my work boots. Figured if I was about to hear my father's last wishes, I should show up as the man he raised, not some polished-up version pretending I'd moved on. My mother and Randy were already sitting inside, side by side like they belonged there. Randy wore that same smug little smirk like this was some formality he had to suffer through before claiming what was his. The attorney, Mr. Lowell, adjusted his glasses and looked at us over a manila folder. I have the most recent version of Troy Brantley's will, dated 8 months ago. His voice was calm, clinical. I felt my stomach knot. Dad and I had talked many times. He'd always said the land, the equipment, the house, it would be mine. Not out of favoritism. Not because I was his only child. But because I was the one who worked it. Every inch of that land ran through my hands. That wasn't just a promise, it was a bond. But as Mr. Lowell read through the document, it was like I'd stepped into someone else's life. To my beloved wife, Marla Brantley, I leave all property, assets, land, and holdings in full ownership, to do with as she sees fit. That was it. My name wasn't mentioned. Not once. I sat there stunned. I couldn't speak. My throat went dry like I'd swallowed dust off the barn floor. I stared at my mother, and she had the nerve to meet my eyes. Her expression was gentle, like she was waiting for me to accept it, like it was all part of some natural order. "I know this isn't what you expected," she said after Mr. Lowell closed the folder. "But your father was thinking of security. Of me." I couldn't breathe. Couldn't blink. Randy clapped a hand on my shoulder on the way out. "We'll figure things out, Casey. This doesn't change who we are." Yes, it did. It changed everything. 2 weeks later, I saw the county land records update. Half the farm, my farm, had been legally transferred to Randy Layton and put into a trust with Jake and Morgan listed as secondary beneficiaries. Just like that, what my father built with blood and calluses became Randy's playground. Jake started tearing up the north field with his new four-wheeler. Morgan was talking about converting the west barn into a wedding venue. They were treating the land like a prize they'd won in a raffle. I packed my things that night and left the house without a word. I didn't even say goodbye to my mother. There was nothing left to say. They thought they'd buried my father and his legacy beneath legal ink and courtroom smiles, but you can't bury a man's truth just because you stole his land, and me? I might have walked off that property with nothing, but I was taking everything with me. The trailer smelled like mildew and regret. It sat off an old gravel road outside Westmoreland, tucked behind an abandoned feed store and a stand of half-dead cottonwoods. The roof leaked when the wind shifted just right, the heater wheezed more than it warmed, and the mattress had springs that could pierce a man's ribs if he rolled over wrong, but it was mine. Or at least, it wasn't theirs. After I left the farm, I didn't sleep for 2 days. Just drove around in my truck, back roads and empty miles, trying to understand how everything I'd worked for could disappear so cleanly. I was supposed to be fixing fences, prepping the fall crop, checking the herd. Instead, I was staring at a cracked ceiling and trying not to scream. I wasn't just grieving my father, I was mourning a whole damn legacy. They didn't just steal land. They severed me from it. Ripped up roots that went back 3 generations and paved over them with lies and paperwork. And for what? A shiny truck for Jake? A business opportunity for Randy? My mother had handed over everything Dad built like it was some bargaining chip in his second-rate marriage. But the longer I sat in that trailer, the more the anger gave way to something sharper, suspicion, because the more I thought about it, the more the timeline didn't sit right. Dad was practically bedridden those last months. Some days, he couldn't remember what day it was. And yet somehow, in that fog of pain and morphine, he'd summoned the clarity to completely rewrite his will? And leave me, his only son, completely out of it? No. That didn't add up. I dug through my glove box and found the last voicemail Dad ever left me. I hadn't listened to it since the funeral. My hand shook as I hit play. "Casey, hey. Listen, I've been thinking. There's something I need to talk to you about." "Don't trust," the message cut off. It wasn't long, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. Don't trust. Who? Randy? Mom? The whole damn situation. I started keeping notes. Dates. Names. Land transfer records. I drove by the courthouse in Wamego and checked public filings. And sure enough, the transfer of the farm had been rushed. The notary used wasn't local. The witness signatures were messy hell. One belonged to a guy from Topeka with no known ties to our family. They were counting on me to disappear. On my grief to keep me quiet. But they forgot something. You can evict a man from his land. You can strip his name off a deed. But you can't take his memory. His instincts. Something was wrong, and I was done licking wounds. It was time to start digging, because if they buried the truth with my father, I was going to unearth it with fire. The more I dug, the clearer it became. My father couldn't have changed that will. Not in his right mind. He was in the final stages of liver cancer by the time that new will was supposedly signed. I remembered the way he looked that last month, thin as a fence post, skin like paper, eyes flickering in and out of awareness. He could barely hold a spoon, let alone a pen, so I drove to the clinic in Manhattan, where he'd had his last treatments. And talked to Amy, a nurse I'd gone to high school with. We hadn't spoken in years, but once I explained what I was after, she got real quiet and told me to wait. 10 minutes later, she came back with a folded copy of his charts. I read every page that night in the trailer with a flashlight and a thermos of coffee. Dad had been on a heavy regimen: morphine, hydromorphone, and lorazepam all at once. According to the log, he was administered an injection for pain just 2 hours before the timestamp on the notarized will. That dose alone would have made it hard for him to form a sentence. So how did he manage to sign off on something that erased me from his life? Answer: he didn't. I drove out to Wamego the next morning, parked across from the courthouse, and pulled up the notary documents online. The signature on the new will looked rushed, uneven, barely legible. It wasn't his normal scrawl. I compared it to the old lease agreements Dad and I signed together, one still sitting in the glove box of my truck. The handwriting didn't match. Not even close. I took photos. I made copies. I printed the logs. Every page made my blood boil hotter. Then came the real kicker. The notary listed on the will was Gerald Nichols, based in Topeka. I called his office pretending to be a prospective client. His assistant said he didn't usually travel more than 10 miles from the city. And never did house calls. But according to the will documents, he'd driven all the way out to Wamego on a weekend to witness my father's signature, with no other witnesses listed besides my mother. It didn't smell right. It stank of manipulation, and if my mother had been there when it was signed, when Dad was so heavily sedated he could barely speak, then she wasn't a grieving widow. She was an accomplice. That was the moment something in me shifted. The morning ended. The son inside me stepped aside. If they forged that will, they didn't just steal land, they desecrated a man's dying wishes. And I wasn't going to let them get away with it. They thought they'd buried the truth with my father, but what they didn't count on was me learning to dig. Jake Layton never had the brains to back up the swagger. He was the kind of guy who thought charm was a loud voice and a shiny truck. And ever since he got a piece of the farm, he acted like he earned it with blisters instead of signatures. I'd see him around Wamego, tossing hay bales like props and taking photos for his Instagram with captions like "Workin' hard on the Brantley place." The Brantley place. As if he ever wore the name, so I waited. Bided my time. Then one Friday night, I walked into Big Eddie's Tavern in St. Mary's, knowing he'd be there. It was Jake's usual watering hole: cheap beer, cheap wings, and plenty of attention from girls who didn't know better. I bellied up next to him, real casual, acting like I was there to bury the hatchet. "Didn't expect to see you here," Jake said, already halfway through his second beer. He looked surprised, but not threatened. "Figured it's time we stopped being weird." I shrugged. "Ain't your fault how things played out." He gave me the dumb smile, the kind you wear when you think you're winning. "Damn right," he said, raising his glass. To fresh starts. I drank with him. Bought the next round. Then another. After 3 beers and a shot of cheap whiskey, Jake started loosening up. "Man," he laughed, slapping the bar, "you should have seen Randy hustling to get that will done before your old man kicked the bucket." Said he wanted to make sure the farm stayed in capable hands. I kept my face flat, neutral. "Yeah?" Jake leaned in, like we were co-conspirators now. "Yeah, dude. Your dad was out of it. Could barely keep his eyes open. Randy brought in this notary guy from Topeka real quick. Mom handled the rest. Just told him where to sign and held the pen steady." My stomach flipped. "Mom handled the rest? You're saying Dad didn't even read it?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Read it?" Jake laughed so hard he choked on his drink. He didn't know what day it was. Mom just told him it was some insurance paperwork. The guy signed it and went back to sleep. He said it like it was funny. Like it was a joke. I smiled back, just barely. "Crazy world, huh?" "Hey," Jake said, bumping his glass against mine. "All's fair in love and inheritance, right?" I left soon after, pretending I had an early shift in the morning. The second I got in my truck, I hit stop on the voice recorder app running in my pocket. It was all there, everything I needed. They forged that will. Manipulated a dying man. Lied through their teeth. And now I had proof. They thought I was broken. Thought I was beaten, but they just gave me the nail I needed to build their coffin. I'd heard of Darla Quinn from back when I was still working the South Field with Dad. She wasn't local, but she had a reputation: sharp, relentless, and meaner than a rattlesnake in July when she smelled a lie. She handled estate cases, mostly, and she'd taken down 2 prominent ranch families in eastern Kansas who'd tried to rewrite their own bloodlines for money. I didn't want a lawyer who talked nice. I wanted one who burned the rot out by the root. Her office was a converted brick house in Manhattan, the kind of place that didn't look like much from the outside but ran hotter than a courthouse inside. I showed up unannounced, wearing my work coat and a folder tucked under my arm. She was reading over another case when I sat down across from her. "You got 20 seconds to convince me this isn't a waste of time," she said, not even looking up. I reached into my folder and laid down the photos: Dad's medical records, the will with the shaky signature, a notarization form signed by a man who didn't even witness it. Then I pulled out my phone and hit play. Jake's voice came spilling out, all drunk confidence and loose truth. Mom handled the rest. He didn't know what day it was. Signed and went back to sleep. By the end, she'd stopped flipping pages. She leaned back, folded her arms, and studied me. How much you want? She asked. I shook my head. Not a dime. I don't want their money. I want my dad's name back on that land. And I want every one of them to feel the weight of what they did. She nodded once, slow and steady, like a hammer being pulled back. All right, Casey, she said. Let's bury them alive. Over the next few weeks, Darla tore into every document we had. She subpoenaed hospital logs, interviewed nurses, pulled notary records, even tracked down Gerald Nichols, the notary from Topeka. He folded quick under pressure, admitted Randy and Marla had asked him to expedite the process without full presence. Then she had handwriting analysts compare my father's signature from 5 prior legal documents to the new will. The differences were undeniable: pressure patterns, alignment, slope. The signature on this revised will, the analyst wrote, appears to have been guided or partially forged. Darla looked at me across her desk one night and said, "We've got motive. We've got manipulation. And now, we've got proof." The suit we filed hit Wamego like a summer tornado. Randy and my mother didn't even see it coming. They thought I was just the quiet son in the trailer, forgotten, grieving, gone, but they underestimated what a son will do when you steal his father's dying breath and use it to sign a lie. This wasn't about money anymore, it was about justice, and justice was about to wear their names. The courtroom in Wamego wasn't built for scandals. Just old pine benches, faded flags, and a judge who looked like he'd rather be watching wheat grow. But that summer, the place buzzed like a kicked hornet's nest. Word spread fast: Troy Brantley's boy sues his own mother and stepfather for fraud. Everyone had an opinion. Some whispered I was greedy. Others said I was brave. But when the courthouse filled up that first day, neighbors, church folks, people I hadn't seen in years, I knew this wasn't just about land anymore. This was about loyalty, legacy, and truth. Darla Quinn worked that courtroom like she'd planted it herself. Calm, controlled, deadly, she started with the medical records. The chart showed Dad was under heavy sedation the day the revised will was signed, barely able to respond to questions. Then came the handwriting analysis, blown up on a projector for the room to see. The old signatures were steady, bold. The one on the new will? Crooked, hesitant. Forced. Randy squirmed. Mom wouldn't look at me. Then Darla called Gerald Nichols, the notary from Topeka. He tried to downplay it, but under oath, he cracked. Admitted he never saw my father sign the will. That Marla insisted everything was above board. I didn't want to cause trouble, he mumbled. Darla didn't let up. So you filed a legal document claiming you witnessed something you never actually saw? He nodded. It was like a nail driven into the courtroom floor. Then came the recording. Jake's voice filled the room, drunk, laughing, careless. Mom handled the rest. He didn't know what day it was. Signed and went back to sleep. The courtroom went silent. I felt heat rising behind my eyes. That voice, the casual betrayal of it, hit harder in public than it ever had in the cab of my truck. When it was Mom's turn to speak, she cried. Not just tears, full-on trembling sobs. Claimed she was scared, manipulated by Randy, just trying to hold the family together. She said Dad wanted her to have the land. That he changed his mind about me, but her words fell flat. Because she'd signed the papers. She'd called the notary. She stood by and watched them carve up a dying man's legacy like it was a roast at Sunday dinner. Randy didn't cry. He just sweated through his collar and muttered about misunderstandings and trying to do what's best for the family. The judge sat through it all, stone-faced. Then, in a voice that echoed off every wall, he said, "Mr. Brantley has proven fraud. This court recognizes the original will as the only valid testament of Troy Brantley's wishes. The property and all related assets will be restored accordingly. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The land was mine again. But more than that, the truth was mine, and finally, it had a voice louder than their lies." The morning after the ruling, I drove back to the farm before the sun came up. Just like Dad used to. Fog rolled low over the fields, clinging to the ground like it didn't want to let go. The wheat rustled in the breeze, and for a second, it almost felt like nothing had changed. But everything had. I stepped out of the truck and walked the perimeter of the barn. Same rusted hinges, same old nail scars in the siding. But for the first time in nearly a year, it felt like mine again, not stolen. Not borrowed, not threatened. Mine. My boots hit the soil with weight. Not just physical. Something deeper. Like the land itself was recognizing me, breathing me back in after a long drought. I ran my hand along the gate to the north pasture, the one Jake had busted open with his four-wheeler last fall. I'd be fixing that soon. Along with the collapsed fence by the pond, the burned-out tractor in the shed, the neglected irrigation lines in the east field. They'd run this place ragged. But land doesn't forget how to grow. You just have to remind it. I opened the door to the farmhouse. It still smelled like lemon polish and thyme. A few of Mom's things were gone: family pictures, lace curtains, that fake crystal fruit bowl she loved so much. Good. Let her take the pieces of her that didn't belong here anymore. I stood in the living room and stared at the fireplace. Dad's old rifle still hung over the mantel, dusty but untouched. My throat tightened. I got it back, Dad, I said aloud, voice low. They tried to erase me, but I'm still here. And so are you. That afternoon, I put up a new sign at the end of the driveway, Brantley Farm. Since 1953, the name had never meant more. The town didn't throw a parade, but neighbors started stopping by again. Chuck Ward brought over a new bail hook. Miss Lila from church baked a pie. Even Sheriff Denny pulled up, leaned on his cruiser, and said, "Took guts, son. You did right." I thanked them, quietly. That's how my dad would have wanted it. Randy and his kids were gone. Moved out 2 nights after the ruling. I heard Jake's truck peeled out so hard it kicked up gravel onto the mailbox. Mom never said goodbye. Never called. Maybe she couldn't face what she'd done. Or maybe she still believed she was right. Either way, I let her go. Some losses you have to stop mourning before they poison everything else. That night, I sat on the porch in Dad's old chair. Stars overhead. The hum of summer bugs in the air. I took a deep breath and smelled earth, pine, and something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The land was mine again, but more importantly, it had never stopped being his, and now, it was ours. The ashes were still warm, but new things were already starting to take root. Randy was gone. Jake and Morgan disappeared right behind him, like smoke off the plains. I heard rumors they were living near Wichita, trying to start some AG business venture. Maybe they'd make it, maybe not. I didn't care. I wasn't chasing them anymore. Mom hasn't called. Not a word since the courtroom. It used to keep me up at night, replaying her voice, her tears, trying to figure out which were real and which were part of the act. But I don't chase her silence now either. She made her choice, I made mine too, and mine is this land. I wake up before the rooster now, drink my coffee by the window as the sun spills over the fields. I've patched every fence line, pulled weeds from the fallow north lot, and repaired the irrigation by hand. Took me a week to clean out the west barn, where Morgan had started hanging fake chandeliers for her wedding business. I ripped every last one of them down. I kept the barn's original beams exposed. Dad liked it that way, raw wood, honest and strong. One afternoon, while clearing out the old grain silo, I found a box of his things: notebooks, field maps, a broken pocket knife, and a Polaroid of us by the creek when I was 10. He had his arm around me, and I was holding a catfish like I'd caught the Loch Ness monster. I sat down right there in the dust and let the quiet settle in. This farm isn't about revenge anymore. That fire burned hot, sure, but fire only clears the way. What comes next is what matters. And what comes next is legacy. I planted sunflowers along the edge of the south field this season. Dad always said they were good for the soil. They're just starting to push through now, green and stubborn. Like me, the Bradley name is back on the land, not out of pride, but out of promise. I've started hiring locals again, just like Dad did. Gave a job to young Marcus Langley down the road. Kid's green as a June blade but eager. I see a bit of myself in him. The old place breathes again. It's slow, but it's steady. And with every nail, every furrow turned, I feel like I'm building something that'll outlive me. Maybe someday I'll have a son or daughter to teach how to dig a post hole, or how to read a thunderhead rolling over the plains, but until then, I'll carry the weight myself, because this land, these 100 acres of sweat and truth, don't just grow crops, they grow memory. They grow grit, they grow after fire, and now, for the first time since I stood at that graveside, I believe something good is growing again. Something real, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take it from me again. If this story hit you deep, if you've ever felt the sting of betrayal or fought to reclaim what's rightfully yours, drop a comment below and tell me your thoughts. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of truth, justice, and redemption. Your support keeps these voices alive.